You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Refreshing wild cherry cola meets smooth cream. The treat you deserve. Pepsi Wild Cherry and Cream. Treat yourself.
Did you know only 6% of people are getting enough fiber? That's why Quaker created Fiber February, a month-long movement to show your gut a little more love. It's like dry January, only easier and more delicious. Quaker has over 100 delicious options that are a good source of fiber. So go buy Quaker Oats today and join the Fiber February movement for a healthy gut.
This episode is brought to you by our Patreon members. Thank you so much.
Join our Patreon for extra episodes, interviews, extra content, and to help support the podcast and help us continue to do the work we do.
Go to patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl to learn more. Gothic kings had riz. I'm Jenny Williamson.
And I'm Jen McMenemy.
And this is Ancient History Fangirl. In our last episode, we delved into the archaeology of the pre-Roman Goths, or at least groups that have historically been aligned with them, to see what they can tell us about these people. We also looked at Gothic language and their own history as told by them, or at least as told by this one guy, a Romanized, Christianized Goth named Jordanes in the mid-500s AD, who may have been engaging in some imperialist myth-making.
And some Christian myth-making.
Right, but may also have been relying on Gothic oral histories available nowhere else, so we can't entirely count it out. 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, all the sources are questionable. Just you wait. We tried to develop a sense of the Goths' material culture and history.
But what about Gothic culture? What do we know about that specifically? What do we know about pre-Roman Gothic culture before the Goths were Romanized and Christianized? And to get a real sense of what is authentically Gothic is really difficult. And it requires us to go back to a time when the Romans wouldn't necessarily have called the Goths Goths. They might have called them Scythians, or they might have called them by a tribal name, Gutones or Gothones.
There are various names that are applied prior to when they start calling them Scythians that are, we don't actually know if those are the same people.
So one problem with trying to answer that question, the who were the Goths question, is that we have both too much information and too little. We don't have much information about the Goths' day-to-day lives and culture. We know almost nothing about their religious practices and beliefs, especially from pre-Roman and pre-Christian times. So we don't have much information about the Goths' day-to-day lives and culture. We know almost nothing about their religious practices and beliefs, especially from pre-Roman and pre-Christian times. And it's easy to just throw up your hands and call them proto-Vikings, and that's kind of what a certain person did in her book. But, we wouldn't call that historically accurate either, necessarily. It's not inaccurate either. This is really tricky, and there's some guesswork involved.
What we do have is military history. A lot of military history from a Roman lens. We know about battles and wars and kings in a very general sense. And all of this, again, is from a Roman lens, the enemy lens, and to call it imperfect is an understatement. And so it's a lot of battles to pick through if you're trying to build a narrative. One Roman in particular wrote a lot about not the Goths specifically, but the Germanic people more broadly. And that person was Tacitus. Tacitus was a Roman statesman and scholar who wrote his seminal work Germania around 98 AD. So one of the first things that Tacitus tells us if you read his Germania is this, quote, "For myself, I concur in opinion with such as suppose the people of Germany never to have mingled by intermarriages with other nations, but to have remained a people pure and independent and resembling none but themselves. Hence amongst such a mighty multitude of men, the same make and form is found in all, eyes stern and blue, yellow hair, huge bodies, but vigorous only in the first onset. Of pains and labor they are not equally patient, nor can they at all endure thrift and heat. To bear hunger and cold they are hardened by their climate and soil." So already there is a lot here to unpack.
No.
I mean, you may notice that this sounds awfully white supremacist, and there's a reason for that. A lot of things Tacitus wrote about Germanic peoples was later adopted by German nationalists and Nazis to build an image of a, quote, glorious German past, unquote, and justify atrocities. There are a lot of minefields in studying the Goths, and some of it has to do with this issue.
His claims that they were, quote, racially pure, unquote, is one of the things that calls back to this sort of Nazi white supremacist myth-making. Another one is the way he, quote, noble savages, unquote, the Germanic peoples. He depicts them as uncorrupted by vices that supposedly afflicted the Roman people. Just check out what he says in this passage, quote, thus, with their virtue protected, they live uncorrupted by the allurements of public shows or the stimulant of feastings. Clandestine correspondence is equally unknown to men and women. Very rare, for so numerous a population is adultery. No one in Germany laughs at vice, nor do they call it fashion to corrupt and to be corrupted.
I also want to talk about what Tacitus was actually alluding to when he says things like this. He was using descriptions of Germanic people in his own time to criticize and comment on his own people, the Romans. He was holding the Germanic people up as a mirror for the Romans and kind of using them as a foil. And I think understanding that is key here to understanding his often very faulty depiction of the Goths and other Germanic peoples as a whole.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I recently saw on the news, like one of these senators said, like, if all the Roman Empire had to do with like the Romans being too promiscuous and effeminate and gay, like this rhetoric that we're talking about is still being used today, and it's still really harmful. So what we're trying to do here is explain to you what Tacitus was doing when he made these statements. And a lot of it had to do with him criticizing his own society. But it's still being used right now, particularly in America, as a way to demonize and propagate really hurtful things. We've seen all these things recently, and it's really important that we let you know that this is how it has been used in modern days. But right now what we're talking about is what this tells us about the time period that Tacitus was living in, and also what we can sort of glean from it about these people.
Yeah, there's multiple harmful lenses on this, and we're trying to sidestep all of it and try to get to the bottom of what we can actually glean that might have been true or true-ish.
And the reason we have to do this is because we don't have very much in the written language of the Gothic peoples that tells us about their day-to-day or their festivals and things like that. And a lot has to do with their culture and what they valued and what they wrote down or didn't write down. And the Romans were, they were conquerors who wrote things down. And, their lens is not always the best, but it's the lens that we have. And the archaeology helps fill in some of those blanks and give us a more complete picture.
One of the things that we're looking at here in terms of a lens is that the early Romans had a fascination with non-Romanized peoples, and they tended to apply dehumanizing stereotypes even when they were genuinely trying to understand them. The further away from the Romans a culture was, the more it was assumed to be quote-unquote barbarian, violent, alien, completely unknowable. This is true of the Germanic peoples Tacitus was writing about.
There's a lot of Roman-era othering in the passage that we read, and it's easy to spot. Categorizing these people as enormous, blonde, able to endure certain types of physical hardship, yet impatient with physical labor, i.e. kind of lazy and also not mentally strong. That's shitty, Tacitus. And the Romans described other people they colonized, such as the Celts, the Gauls, the Picts, and the Thracians. The Thracians got a lot of this too, in a really similar way.
Yeah, when you start studying all these peoples from a Roman lens, you really see the same stereotypes kind of echoing throughout, right? And that's definitely one of them.
Yeah, I just think back all the time to the Thracians of how unmanageable the men were and how the women were the best bed slaves.
Yeah, and a lot of that is a way to justify how they were enslaving them.
Mm-hmm. So let's take a closer look at Tacitus's claims of racial purity. Quote, I concur in opinion with such as suppose the people of Germany never have mingled by intermarriages with other nations. The thing is, the Goths have never been a quote-unquote racially pure group. And that's probably true going all the way back to the groups called the Chthonies in Poland and Scandinavia, the Weilbark and the Chernikov cultures. According to the ancient sources, these groups bridged the gap between Celtic and Germanic from their earliest days. And archaeologists point out that the Weilbark people were not the only people migrating in that area. Other multicultural groups were moving with them, of which they were only a small part.
realistically, the Goths as a people were not just one people. I think that's probably true.
Yeah, and they weren't necessarily universally white and blonde.
Absolutely not. You can't assume that everybody here is in a silo. Like, that's the mistake that you were making as a middle schooler, right? Like, assuming everyone's in this weird sort of cultural silo where they never talk to anybody else. It's not true.
And that's the way we teach history to small children so that they don't get overwhelmed. But as adults, we have to be able to figure out that, like, that's not how anyone works.
Right. So anyway, let's also take a closer look at how Tacitus described the Germans in terms of purity as a proud, untouched culture, uncorrupted, specifically uncorrupted by Roman civilization, or where he doesn't say that specifically, uncorrupted by the vices and sins that Romans tend to enjoy, because that's the subtext here.
Not at all something we might be seeing now in late-stage capitalism.
Like, I really get the sense that Tacitus had a bone to pick with the excesses of his own times, and I've seen the theory that he described the Germanic peoples as socially isolated and uncorrupted and manly and pure, again, so they could be a foil to highlight Roman multiculturalism, indulgence, and corruption. There's a lot of xenophobia here where he's like, the Romans are just letting anybody into the empire and just conquering all these places, and suddenly we have senators who are Gauls. I'm reading a lot of xenophobia into this, and also, criticizing what he sees as Roman corruption and decadence and stuff like that. You could read the Germania as Tacitus's veiled criticism of his own time. I think what he describes as Germanic traits really has more to do with what he sees as Roman traits than what he sees as actual Germanic traits, because he never met any Germanic peoples, as far as I know. He's getting a lot of information like second and third hand. So all of this is to say that you have to take what we're about to tell you from Tacitus with a giant boulder of salt, a continent-sized salt lick, perhaps.
Julius Caesar-sized one. Don't lick it.
Don't lick Julius Caesar. Don't.
If you see a Julius Caesar-sized and shaped salt lick, you know it's him. He's in disguise. Don't lick it.
Ew, I have to wash out my mouth with soap. Anyway, so there are hugely problematic things in this document. This is really taking it dark. Tacitus was othering a people that his own were trying to conquer, using demeaning stereotypes to justify that conquering. He was also using these people as a vehicle to criticize his own aristocratic class in a way that's been horrifically used and repurposed millennia later, again, to justify atrocities. To top it all off, he probably never met any Germanic peoples or traveled to the regions he's writing about, and the Germanic people he's writing about may or may not have been culturally continuous with the Goths. These are all reasons to question this.
But Tacitus's work is among the most detailed texts we have. And if we don't mention it, we're leaving vast swaths of information out. So we're going to tell you some things about what Tacitus says in the hope that it can teach us something maybe about the Goths.
You'll see hints of it later on, where you can refer back to that and be like, oh, this goes all the way back to Tacitus. It's kind of like a floor we have to lay.
It's a wonky floor, but it's all we got.
It's a floor with a lot of holes in it. Don't fall in the holes.
I don't think it's got holes. I think what it has is like one of those really uneven floors where you like try to put your table on it and it like slants to the right. You've got to prop it up with books. That's how I see it.
Yeah. Are we better off without it? You could argue that.
No, you need this episode. You need this foundation. And you need to know the problems with this foundation. Otherwise, you're going into this series and you're going into this understanding of this people without really getting why research into it and why drawing this map of them is so tricky.
Tacitus talks about many, many Germanic tribes, but he mentions a specific tribe called the Goths living near the Black Sea. And this may have been around when the wild bark culture started arriving here and becoming the Cherniakov culture. I don't know. He says, quote, "Beyond the Lygians dwell the Gothones under the rule of a king, and thence held in subjection somewhat stricter than the other German nations, yet not so strict as to extinguish all their liberty. Immediately adjoining are the Rugians and the Lamovians upon the coast of the ocean, and of these several nations the characteristics are a round shield, a short sword, and kingly government." As opposed to the government of other Germanic cultures, which he emphasizes is tends to be elected. Like, they did have kings, but they elected their kings and they made a lot of decisions by consensus. So what he's saying is that they have more of an autocratic government, led by a king, than other Germanic cultures. This description is kind of weird. First, the weapons. The modern-day Gothic historian Herwig Wolfram calls the combination of short sword and round shield a bit militarily incoherent. Quote, "Taken literally, this would represent an incomplete set of arms and a strange mixture of cavalry and infantry weapons." It doesn't make a lot of sense.
Then there's the description of kingship, how the Gothic kings were stricter than the other Germanic peoples. And we'll have more to say on that a little bit later. For now, we'll tell you that Herwig Wolfram has a theory that these Chthonies were Goths, and that they were originally oppressed and dominated by these other tribes, first until roughly the 50s AD by the Celtic Lygians, and then from roughly the 50s to the 100s by the Germanic Vandals. And for this reason, early in their history, the Goths may have developed both Celtic and Germanic characteristics. And they had one differentiating quality. They did not bury their dead with weapons. And this is a quote from Wolfram, quote, apparently because they had no battles to fight in the hereafter. I don't think that's quite true.
There might be a mythology around that, which I think is really interesting because if you look at, like, for example, Norse mythology, which they're often compared to, like, they go to Valhalla and, you know, the whole point is this warrior ethos in the afterlife. So I included it because it made me curious about what their mythology might say about death.
Well, and it's kind of interesting and nice to think that maybe you do get to the afterlife and you get to lay your weapons down. But I do think that idea of laying your weapons down in the afterlife, like, I'm not saying it's not true that was culturally attached to them, but it is also something that I can see attached to the Christian monk showing here.
Maybe so.
This episode is brought to you by Redfin. You're listening to a podcast, which means you're probably multitasking. Maybe even scrolling home listings on Redfin, saving homes without expecting to get them. But Redfin isn't just built for endless browsing. It's built to help you find and own a home. With agents who close twice as many deals, when you find the one, you've got a real shot at getting it. Get started at redfin.com. Own the dream.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
I'm RJ Decker, a private investigator, uncovering the Sunshine State's darkest secrets.
Tuesdays, it's the premiere of ABC's hottest new crime show.
RJ freaking Decker, as I live and breathe.
He's a private eye.
It's not a standard murder, it's something bigger.
And a public mass.
Trying to get sent back to prison today?
You go to prison one time and suddenly it's all the jokes.
RJ Decker, series premiere, Tuesdays on ABC and stream on Hulu.
Anyway, so here's another data point. Pliny the Elder, writing in 77 AD, just 12 years prior, mentions a tribe called the Gothones as well, but his Gothones lived around the Vistula, a river in Poland. And that kind of tracks with the idea of the Goths as the Wild culture living in Poland prior to the 100s AD and then moving to the Black Sea in the next few centuries. Like maybe there's some over there and some over here. Like if we consider Pliny the Elder and Tacitus's accounts as being chronological, that movement started and could be tracked within this 12-year period, or maybe they were just groups that could be identified as that group on both sides of that divide by now. It's also worth it to talk for a minute about Germania, the region and people that Tacitus was writing about. Romans sometimes called it Free Germania or Barbaric Germania to differentiate it from Germanic provinces that were conquered and in the process of Romanization at the time. Tacitus's Germania was about the unconquered Germanic peoples north of the Rhine, living roughly between the Rhine and Vistula rivers, bound by east and west, and the upper Danube in the south.
It's not clear whether the Germanic peoples Tacitus wrote about could have included the peoples who became known as the Goths. If it did include the Goths, if the people he called the Gothones were the Goths, they would have only been a small group of people among many. Tacitus probably never met these people he was writing about or traveled to free Germania. However, when we wrote about Celtic cultures, we discussed how the Celts stretched across an extremely broad territory, from Ireland all the way to Turkey at certain points in history. This was not a unified country, but a bunch of individual tribes with constantly shifting alliances and shared culture and language that nonetheless still varied considerably. And it's possible that the Germanic peoples had a similar range, right? Probable, really. And that the Goths and the Germanic people Tacitus wrote about were at least somewhat culturally similar. It's possibly accurate to say that just as all Gauls were Celts, but not all Celts were Gauls, most Goths were Germanic peoples, but not all Germanic peoples were Gothic. Maybe.
And I think that changes as the history goes on, but I think early on we could maybe say that. So Tacitus calls Germania, quote, a region hideous and rude, under a rigorous climate, dismal to behold or to cultivate. He describes the Germanic people as a poor, simple culture, their wealth held primarily in their cattle, which were smaller and scrawnier than other cattle. They didn't even have much iron, which is why they fought with spears. A spear point requires much less metal than a sword. Quote, the money which they like is the old and long known, that indented with milled edges, or that impressed with a chariot and 2 horses. Silver, too, is what they seek more than gold, from no fondness or preference, but because small pieces are more ready in purchasing things cheap and common. Jen, I know you have thoughts about that.
I have so many thoughts about this, and it just... When I was giving comments to Jenny about this, one of the things I said was, it's really difficult for me right here because what I can see Tacitus saying is putting his Roman values on what the Gothic peoples or Germanic peoples might have valued and saying that their values are not as important as his, right? Like he says that like, oh, they use this really simple coin because like it's cheap and easy. And it's like, or they just don't care about coins. That's not how they barter, right? Like maybe cows are how they barter or something else has more value to them than a bit of metal.
It's actually interesting because if you look at the Ulfilas Bible, which we will talk about in a bit, when we look at the language in that, the word for wealth and the word for cattle was the same word. So you can tell that their wealth, like their big coins, right, were their cattle. That was like their big $100,000 bill right there is this cow. Like this is like their savings account. How much worth gold and silver has, probably they would use coins like that when they're trading with the Romans because they valued those things a lot. We know that they did trade with the Romans. For example, there have been vast quantities of Roman amphorae of wine found in some early, potentially Gothic settlements. So we know they were trading with the Romans from an early time, probably for booze, among other things.
The other thing that I wanted to say was about the spearheads. And I do think that you're looking at a people who moved around quite a lot. They did know how to metal work, we think, but they didn't really have like mining operations and weren't necessarily looking for the raw materials to make some types of weapons. So they had a lot of trees and it was quite easy to make spears because that was what they had. And I think that, again, the Romans are like, oh, they don't know how to make proper weapons. They don't know how to do this. It's like, or they didn't value that because what they had and their way of fighting, this was very effective. And to mine things or whatever was not an effective use of their time culturally.
Well, yeah, until they come up against the Roman army who use a lot of iron and a lot of swords and they're outmatched in terms of weaponry, then they start having swords more.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those moments where like until they come up against the Roman army and the Roman people who are definitely hell-bent on invading and conquering, they now need more swords and iron.
Yeah, so some of this is backed up in the archaeology. It's true that pre-Roman Germanic people, for instance, mainly did use spears because they didn't have access to a lot of iron. This is really compared to, like, for example, Celtic people who had mines. According to Tacitus, their clothes were very simple, but just a long mantle. By mantle, I'm imagining like a cloak or other clothing that was made of one big piece of cloth, attached with a clasp, or since metal is expensive and these are simple people, according to Tacitus, with a thorn. The more wealthy might wear a tight-fitting vest of some kind.
And here again, we have to do corroboration with the archaeology in the Wellbark and Chernikov graves. In both the Wheelbark and Chernikov cultures, jewelry has been found, bracelets, torques, and other items that indicate these people did have more material wealth than other cultures around them. In our last episode, we talked about how the Wheelbark and Chernikov cultures were more wealthy than their neighbors because of the amber trade. Tacitus said the Germans wore a lot of furs, the, quote, skins of savage beasts, rather than having a tradition of weaving or spinning. They sewed the hides of wild beasts together to make interesting patterns, and also used, quote, the skins of monsters from the deep and the distant ocean, in seas unknown. We're both wondering if he was referring to something like maybe seal skin.
I was actually interested in that because some Arctic peoples do use things like seal skin as like a sort of water-resistant clothing. So I was wondering if it was kind of calling back to that.
Yeah, well, and I was just thinking like whale bones. We famously know they use them in corsets, but they would make great armor too. Anyway, Women dressed completely differently, according to Tacitus, quote, orderly attired in linen embroidered with purple and use no sleeves, so that all their arms are bare, the upper part of their breast is withal exposed, end quote.
I feel like we can't trust anything Tacitus says about the clothing, because, like, first off, purple would have been an extremely expensive dye. Like, only emperors wore purple. Like, where are they getting this purple?
Well, that's the thing, right, Jenny? Like, purple is extremely expensive for Romans because of what they made it from. I don't know what the Goths would have made it from. Like, are there different flowers that grow further up in the continental Europe that would have made a good purple dye? Like, I don't have the answer, right?
I think that's kind of why I wanted to include this passage. Like, in one breath, he's like, they only wear the furs of dead animals sewn together to make patterns. But then the women are wearing these, like, luxurious purple linen clothing, but also their tits are out.
But not the nips, only the upper part.
Well, he doesn't mention the nips.
No, I would imagine you would be covering the nips. Like, if he meant that it was, like, the boobs out, it would be like a Minoan look, right? Like, we've seen tits out.
I know, I'm picturing a Minoan look, but I could be wrong.
I'm picturing like a very, very low, so just the nips and the underboob are covered. But anyway, what do I know?
We know nothing, really. Like, Tacitus seems to know a lot, but a little, as is so often the case.
I love his scandalization at, like, the arms being bare. I'm like, dude, in Rome, women had their arms bare all the time. All the time.
I wonder if he's more scandalized about the arms or the boobs.
Well, he says them both, the use of no sleeves. I'm like, okay. Like, I mean, I've seen a lot of Roman dresses made. Like, they had bare arms. Oh, no.
But also Germanic women were very, very virtuous. We'll get to that part.
And very buxom.
Oh, so buxom. In battle, Tacitus tells us, the Germans carried light javelins, as we were discussing. They used spears, or frams in their language, with short, narrow points, very sharp. The spears could be hurled or used for hand-to-hand fighting, and they were very important, easy to produce using the materials they had, trees, theoretically. They went into battle naked.
Well, that's very, very Celtic.
Or wearing a light cocksock.
It's a cassock.
It's actually cassock, but we decided somewhere else to only use the word cocksock for that, so that's what we're doing.
A cassock is not a cocksock in any way, shape, or form, but sure.
I want you to picture a cocksock.
A modesty sock. I always think of them like an elephant's trunk.
What is a cassock, really? What is that? Like a tunic, like a big tunic?
I always think of them from, like, religion, so I have to just Google this for a minute because we're not talking about that.
Yeah, I think it's like one of those words that's been translated to something else. I think they're probably what they mean is like a big tunic.
What it means now is like a Christian clerical robe. It's kind of like just like a big long robe.
They don't probably mean that. Just imagine a cocksock, you guys.
That's not what they mean. They mean like just a long robe.
I can't imagine them actually going into battle wearing a Christian monk's robe. I don't think that's what they're doing.
Like kind of a long piece of fabric. Like that's what a cassock is. So I don't know.
Question mark. No helmet. Their only ostentation, the curious colors on their shields. I actually want to pause here and talk about archaeology again for a second and those shields. So in the early 1920s, researchers found an enormous seagoing vessel in a bog on an island in southeastern Denmark. It was called the Hjortspring boat. I've seen it. I've actually seen this boat. It's in the National Museum in Denmark. And it dated from roughly 400 to 300 BC. An enormous 62-foot-long plank-built ship was found, as well as 131 shields, 33 shield bosses, which is a round metal circle in the middle of the shield. It kind of adds to the strength of the shield. 138 iron spearheads, 31 bone and antler spearheads, 11 iron swords, and a few chainmail coats. The entire thing was believed to be a kind of votive offering deliberately sunk into the bog. Like, probably the people who won the battle took the enemies, like the defeated enemies, like gear and ships and everything, and sunk that into the bog as a offering to the gods.
Hot.
Sexy.
Anyway, this find does corroborate some of what Tacitus tells us about Germanic weapons.
And it gives us some nuance here, which is what I want to talk about.
Yeah, and mostly it confirms that they had spears. Mostly spears. But the wealthy, and it was probably the wealthy, had swords and coats of mail.
The mail coats, like, that's a Celtic thing. Like, that goes back, maybe if I'm remembering correctly, to like the 500s BC. So, like, there's clearly cultural exchange going on here.
There were also blacksmithing tools found, indicating that they were skilled metal workers. And it wasn't so simple as, to quote Tacitus, these were poor people with little metal. They probably could make the little metal they had stretch, which is probably why most people had spears and not swords.
Right. And also, the higher status among them did have the ability to get or access chainmail armor and swords. So it's not like they didn't have that stuff. And this is very pre-Roman.
And for many Germanic warriors, again, except for the upper classes, your shield was basically your only defense. They didn't have other armor. Some of the shields in this find were rectangular, some were oval. A few were found with traces of paint. Roman writers describe a riot of colors and patterns on Germanic shields, and they may have used designs on these shields to denote tribal or family affiliation, like a crest of arms. And again, that makes sense, right? We don't know exactly how, I don't know, I haven't done the deep dive into how they fought or how they found each other on the battlefield, but this is one way you could do that easily.
Yeah. Because the confusion of the battlefield, it could be hard if everybody's kind of wearing the same cock socks.
Kazakhs, yes.
Right. And nothing else. It could be hard to figure out, who, in the chaos of battle, who's the enemy and who isn't.
To bring it to the lowest, saddest place. Also, when the battle is over, this is one way of identifying some of your loved ones, right? So, round shields, like Tacitus mentioned, were smaller, they covered less of the body, and were mainly useful in creating shield walls, which the Goths tended to do later in their history when they started encountering the Romans who were masters at the shield wall.
And you see the Vikings doing it later on, like the shield wall, and the Saxons, this became like a Germanic tactic throughout the continent, really, and elsewhere. So Tacitus said Germanic armies were mainly infantry, although wealthier sons of nobles might be in the cavalry. He tells us the Germanic people conscripted 100 men from every village to serve in their wars. Returning veterans were referred to as, quote, those of the 100 band, as a mark of honor. But if any abandoned their shield on the battlefield, they would be forever outcast, banned from sacrifices or assemblies. Many who did not show courage in battle later hung themselves, according to Tacitus.
This is Jen.
And Jenny.
From Ancient History Fangirl, and we're here to tell you about Jenny's scorching historical romantasy based on Alaric of the Visigoths, Enemy of My Dreams. Amanda Boucher, best-selling author of the Kingmaker Chronicle, says, quote, this book has everything: high-stakes action, grit, ferocity, and blazing passion. Julia and Alaric are colliding storms against a backdrop of the brutal dangers of ancient Rome. They'll do anything to carve their peace out of this treacherous world and not just survive, but rule.
Enemy of My Dreams is available wherever books are sold.
Halliday presents, in the red corner, the undisputed, undefeated Weed Whacker Guy. Champion of hurling grass and pollen everywhere. And in the blue corner, the challenger, extra strength Halliday. Eye drops that work all day to prevent the release of histamines that cause itchy allergy eyes. And the winner by knockout is Halliday. Halliday, bring it on.
This episode is brought to you by Cologuard. Do you know what's really scary? Not screening for colon cancer when you turn 45. The Cologuard test is non-invasive, requires no special prep or time off work, and ships right to your door. In just 3 simple steps, Cologuard takes the scare out of colon cancer screening. If you're 45 or older and at average risk, ask your healthcare provider about the Cologuard test. Cologuard is available by prescription only. Learn more or request a prescription today at Cologuard.com/screen.
Is there a baby in your life who's about to start solid foods? This can be such a confusing and stressful time. As a mom of 7, I really struggled with spoon feeding my oldest baby. But once I realized that babies can safely feed themselves real, wholesome foods using the principles of baby-led weaning, feeding the rest of my babies became an actually enjoyable experience instead of something that I used to dread. Hi, I'm Katie Ferraro, college nutrition professor and dietitian specializing in baby-led weaning, and I host the Baby-Led Weaning Made Easy podcast. Each week, we cover evidence-based, safe infant feeding practices for parents and caregivers of babies who are 6 to 12 months of age. So, if you're confused by all the conflicting info you hear about starting solid foods, or you want easy, actionable tips on how to safely prep food for your baby, or introduce allergenic foods, or figure out when to drop a milk feed, we cover all that and more, plus interviews with the world's leading feeding experts in 2 new episodes each week. Search Baby-Led Weaning wherever you listen to podcasts, and happy feeding.
So anyway, let's talk about women in Germanic culture. This should be fun.
It worked out better for them than in Roman culture, right? Right?
The picture is mixed, Jen. If you listen to our Galla Placidia episode, which we re-released recently, that was about how Germanic, and by extension maybe Gothic, women had more freedom and respect in Germanic culture than in Roman culture. And that may be true, kind of. The picture is complicated on that.
Unlike Romans, who separated their soldiers from the general public and didn't allow them to have families, women and children tended to accompany the Germanic peoples into war. And we do see this happening with the Goths as well. This was said to increase the valor of the warriors. The women and children would be near enough to the battle that the men could hear their cries and doleful howlings. Sometimes the women bared the bottom of their breasts in their sleeveless dresses.
I think it was the whole breast, Jen.
No, remember the upper part's already bare. So they just had to loop down the bottom. Full Minoan.
Right. It's easy access.
Probably it's so they can breastfeed easier. But anyway, getting back on track, sometimes the women bared their breasts at the back of the battle line, wailing at any deserters that soon they would be taken into slavery, which was said to be the thing a Germanic man feared most, the enslavement of his family. The men were likely to fight harder if they knew their womenfolk were watching.
This is my perennial question, is why baring your breasts was seen as this sort of universal sign of distress.
So it kind of goes back to, and I will eventually do an episode on this, it goes back to the sort of performative ways in which grief was expressed in these ancient societies. And some of it had to do with, particularly with women, with the rending of clothes, the tearing of hair. That is the way in which they were expressing this sort of internal feeling externally.
I wonder if the baring of the breast has to do with the fact that this person is so distressed and so broken down that the norms of how you act in public have just completely gone by the wayside to them.
It might be something like that. It might be something like, you're bearing me to the elements of everything. What should be ours is now anyone's up for grabs. But there's a performative element to grief in ancient cultures, particularly the Greek and Roman cultures. And I encountered this a few times. I will eventually get to do an episode on there, but I just haven't got there yet. And part of it has to do with how you publicly expressed grief and how you would hire sometimes mourners to do this. It's a really interesting thing, Jenny.
It is. I'm so interested in that. It is weird, though, if I was... My husband was losing his battle and the enemy was going to come and take us all into slavery. The last thing I would do is whip my titties out. That would not be on my list of things.
Dude, the first thing I'd do is whip my boobs out. I'd be like, listen, you want to see these girls again and they are magnificent. You get your ass back there. You don't, I'm going to leave these out for the first enemy guy who comes in and I'm going to be like, hi, babes.
That's one tactic, I suppose.
I'm mercenary sometimes.
Listen, we're in survival mode. Dem titties need to be out.
I got to use everything I got to get through this, right? If you're not brave enough, I'm going to go on that battlefield like a Valkyrie, tits out with a sword ready to go. Maybe I'll distract them long enough to let my kids escape or my dog. I mean, listen, if we go by any of the breastplates we've seen in so many different movies about female warriors, it's not even going to cover the nips anyway. So what's the point?
Those very titty-centric breastplates would just direct the sword right to where your heart is and where you don't want to be stabbed. These are not helpful garments.
That's what I'm saying. Go full Minoan. Okay, so let's get back to what Tacitus tells us. Tacitus says, quote, "In history, we find that some armies already yielding and ready to fly have been by women restored through their inflexible importunity and entreaties, presenting their breasts and showing their impending captivity, an evil to the Germans, then by far most dreadful when it befalls their women. They even believe them endowed with something celestial and the spirit of prophecy. Neither do they disdain to consult them, nor neglect the responses which they return. In the reign of the deified Vespasian, we have seen Veleda for a long time, and by many nations esteemed and adored as a divinity."
So the Germans loved their women, listened to them and respected them, even deified them. They fought harder because the idea of their women enslaved terrified them like nothing else did. They brought their wounds to their female kindred to heal, turned to them for comfort after battle. So women had high rank in German society, right? Well, So the picture we get on this, according to Tacitus, is quite mixed. We talked about Germanic marriage customs in our episode on Ataulf and Galla Placidia, and most of that information was gleaned from Tacitus. From him, we learned that the Germanic people were one of the few ancient peoples where marriage was between two people only, i.e. no plural wives. That was true except for very high-ranking men who, Tacitus assures us, marry multiple women purely for political alliances and not for base lust.
Oh no, not just for base lust.
No lust involved here, none.
I'm just going to keep going and maybe have some wine. In Germanic culture, it's the man who gives the dowry to his wife, as we've said before. We've talked at length in other episodes about how this could indicate a more level balance of power for women in marriage, and also provides the woman with some financial security if she loses her husband. Again, even like we carry that down today, that's why your engagement ring is supposed to look like XYZ or be of such a value.
I thought the whole idea of like the ring being like 2 months of salary or something was like a De Beers invention.
It's supposed to be like, essentially like it's a woman's fuck you fund, right? Like it's supposed to have a certain value, like to show that the man can take care of you and provide for you.
But also you could sell it if the marriage goes south.
However, these gifts were this dowry was generally things that the guy wanted, not sparklies, and that included weapons, oxen and horses, shields, etc. In my marriage, I have an axe. Glenn does have a sword. But I like my axe.
I mean, to be fair, oxen and horses were just general wealth.
Yeah. Tacitus tells us this reason, quote, that the woman may not suppose herself free from the considerations of fortitude and fighting, or exempt from the casualties of war. The very first solemnities of her wedding serve to warn her that she comes to her husband as a partner in his hazards and fatigues, that she is to suffer alike with him, to adventure alike, during peace or during war. This the oxen joined in the same yoke plainly indicate, this the horse ready equipped, this the present of arms. 'Tis thus she must be content to live, thus to resign to life. That tells us a lot about maybe their actual, I tend to think some of these people were quite nomadic, and that tells us about that too. It also supposes that women probably did go into war and have a martial role in some cases.
Yes, I see a lot of equality in that. Women were to adventure alike with their men. They weren't staying home by the hearth. They were exchanging arms and being partners in battle. I see that as a kind of a statement of equality, and maybe I'm putting a modern lens on it, but that's how it hits me.
I mean, I also see that as a statement of what their life was like, right? It's not, to me, yes, from a modern lens, there is a statement of equality here. But what Tacitus is saying is, if you married a Gothic man, you were binding yourself to all of his hardships, all of his adventures. There would be no safety or protection for you unless your man was able to protect you and keep you safe, or you were able to protect yourself and keep yourself safe. And he's definitely trying to paint this picture of Roman women who are protected and safe by the walls of their city and their government and these men. The Roman women are removed from this hardship. Whereas Jenny and I are I don't know, I think I'd rather just be out there camping with them, seeing what's going on.
It also indicates, and I think this is super important, that nomadic lifestyle. This is not a culture where the women stayed home from battle, and it's not a culture where the women stayed home while the men just roved wild and free. The women came along, the kids came along.
But it also makes me, wonder about the displacement of these people. Were they always nomadic, or were they constantly being displaced by others and moving around? I feel a sadness there too.
So anyway, all of this tracks with other things that we know about Germanic culture, how women went to war with their men. It also hints at a tradition of warrior women that the Romans also hint at when they call the Goths Scythian. Remember, we've done whole episodes on Scythian warrior women. And it concurs with the archaeology where female graves are prevalent in Wild-Bark culture moving south and east. So it's really clear that women were a huge part of that original migration. It wasn't just a bunch of dudes. So, at least according to Tacitus, Germanic men and women were equally yoked together in war, adventure, and travel. There's also a hint at a warrior women tradition, which Jourdain's also suggests, and we'll get to that in more detail later. However, lest you think that the Germanic people were proto-feminists, Tacitus takes pains to tell us how bad the Germanic men were at splitting household labor. They spent most of their time lazing by the fire, sleeping in late, quote, in indolence, resigned to sleep in repasts. Women, children, household slaves, and what Tacitus called ancient men did all the chores.
So, in addition, there is some strangely familiar sounding purity cultural bullshit here in Tacitus, right? We suspect some of that comes from Tacitus's judgments about the licentiousness of his own people specifically.
The women were too slutty, Jen. As the ancients say, too slutty.
Of course, the women are too slutty. It's always the slutty women's fault.
That will topple your empire if the ladies are too slutty.
Anyway, Tacitus tells us that the Germanic peoples, both men and women, were notably sexually pure and did not fornicate before marriage and tended to marry in their 20s and not as 14-year-olds to 53-year-olds. Anyway, according to Tacitus, chastity was an important value all the way through the Germanic people's lives. The Germanic peoples were, quote, by no seducing shows and public diversions, by no irritations from banqueting, of learning, and of any secret intercourse by letters. They are all equally ignorant, men and women. And I mean, this to me feels very much like Tacitus is just hurling barbs at the upper class men and women of his society.
He's using this noble savage trope to elevate the Germanic people and, by comparison, insinuate that all of these women, but also men too, were just too slutty and too licentious and too plotty and too overeducated and all of that.
Tacitus, I feel like in this moment, is very much having a make Rome great again by going back to those original Augustinian values of home and hearth and women not being slutty and just producing all the children.
Oh, he's having a paroxysm of that right now.
Yes, and it is a very make Rome great again movement, right? It's very much a sexual purity, chastity, except for within marriage. And that was something Romans, even during the Great Rome period, were not adhering to. Ask Julia the Elder how that went down. But anyway.
It was always a construct from the beginning. I'm sure back in the 500s BC when they first founded the Republic, the women were just as slutty.
One of the things we're seeing also has to do with who is doing these translations and what is being preserved from the original Latin to the people who were preserving it and transcribing it later on, i.e. your Christian monks. I don't know how much of the original Tacitus exists that wasn't copied down by someone else later. That's what I always see when I see purity culture like that. I'm like, okay, but how much of this was here in the original and how much was a little insert? I don't know.
Anyway, he also says adultery was very rare amongst the Germanic peoples and severely punished. But it generally was the women punished, shocker, by their husbands and the whole community. If a woman is found to be sleeping with someone not her husband, good lord, a woman choosing who to have sex with, oh no. The husband first cut off her hair and then kicked her out of the house naked and then whipped her all around the village. So after that, she could never marry again, and nobody excused her for her slutty behavior, no matter how young or beautiful. Quote, for a woman who has prostituted her person, no pardon is ever granted. Tacitus assures us that, quote, in truth, nobody turns vices into mirth there, nor is the practice of corrupting and of yielding to corruption called the custom of the age. I mean, this is a huge dig at his own people.
I mean, if Tacitus knew about the Scarlet Letter, he'd be putting it all over these women. So Tacitus tells us that, no doubt, unlike slutty Roman wives, among the Germanic peoples, quote, none but virgins marry, and where to a single marriage all their views and inclinations are at once confined. Thus, as they have but one body and one life, they take but one husband, that beyond him they may have no thought, no further wishes, nor love him only as their husband, but as their marriage. To restrain generation and the increase of children is esteemed an abominable sin, as also to kill infants newly born. Okay, so breaking this down, he's saying they did not get on with the abortions and they did not have any contraceptions. And again, this sounds very familiar. It's very, very, this translation itself just makes me think of a different person in a cassock translating this for us.
All the woman's sexuality is not just heterosexual. It is her sexuality is only the husband, nobody else. The woman is only focused on home, hearth, and family. That's where her sexual orientation lies.
It goes beyond that. Their sexuality, everything to them is to their husband. And that is also to the covenant of their marriage. Everything is given to the husband to keep their marriage working. It is the woman's job to do what they need to keep that marriage working by giving everything to their husband.
Right, and also to restrain generation and the increase of children is esteemed an abominable sin. Obviously, no contraception. No abortion. I mean, they did have methods of abortion in the ancient world.
Yeah, sounds familiar. I can't imagine where that's still happening today because we know that that sounds really, really bad. Oh, wait. So Tacitus continues to tell us what women were up to.
Tacitus has more to say, everybody. Everyone sit down and listen.
Come on, women, get complicit in your own subjugation. He tells us that women even breastfed their own kids all the time. They did this all the time, Jenny. They never used wet nurses. They were, quote, reared naked and nasty, and thus grow into those limbs, into that bulk, which with marvel we behold. Yeah, these were naked, huge babies who by being constantly breastfed grew into their limbs. I mean, that just describes all children.
All these women had these large adult sons.
Still breastfeeding.
20 years later.
It just cracks me up because it's like I feel like Tacitus has never been around a child before. My nephew is about 8 months old now, and he went from being this tiny little thing to this like scriggling huge creature.
We marvel to behold his strapping limbs.
He's my brother calls him the thickness. He calls him chunky. He's got these like chunky thighs. He's a big boy, the bigness. I'm like, I keep telling him, I'm like, please don't put those issues on him at this age. Like, he's 8 months old. But anyway.
I mean, look, this is the time to do it, Jen.
Started early. But anyway, where I was going with this is my nephew, like, is starting to get to the point where he's going to be able to pull off his own diaper. And we're like, oh, just wait. He's just going to run around naked all the time. That's what small kids do. So they're just annoyed that these children are running around naked.
So, Jen, it will surprise nobody to hear that Tacitus tells us that the Germanic people were heavy drinkers.
Yeah, he also told us that children in wealthy houses, Jenny, they were also strapping and large. It wasn't just like the children of simple farmers and cattle drovers. Like, we kind of expect that from the lower classes, but the upper classes are also strapping and go around naked as children. It's like,
I think this is another thing that's more about his own aristocratic class, really, than these people. Like, you guys wondering why you have scrawny children, like...
I was like, can we not talk about the naked children? Like, just let them be kids.
I want to talk about the alcoholism now.
Oh, we want to talk about the heavy drinking they did? Cool.
Tacitus tells us that the Germans were heavy drinkers.
But wait, Jenny, that can't be true because he told us that they don't drink a lot and they don't ever celebrate or feast. That was the Roman decadence. That wasn't what these noble people did. Like, literally, just 2 pages ago, you told me that.
A wizard did it. Tacitus contradicts himself all the time. Like, sometimes it's like about what they wear. Sometimes it's about whether or not they're noble savages, quote unquote. And like I said, there have been archaeological digs where they found in these settlements, like Chernikov culture settlements, just vast quantities of like smashed wine amphoras from Rome. So the men, at least, slept till late in the day, and then they bathed and, quote, sat down to meat, every man apart upon a particular seat and at a separate table. Kind of a weird scene. Drinking occurred both night and day without ceasing. Drunken brawls were common and usually ended in, quote, maimings and slaughter.
Hot.
Sexy. This description of the separate meats is kind of weird because Tacitus also, this is another, classic Tacitus contradiction. He also describes these large community-wide banquets which were not separate meats. Their feasts were also strategy sessions where people deliberated disputes, formed alliances, appointed leaders, and most of this was done absolutely trashed, as the Germanic people believed that the more drunk you were, the more likely you were to be honest. Being drunk made you more trustworthy, and thus all important deliberations must take place when you were drunk.
Are you telling me that like nobody did anything like important while trashed at a symposium or like a Roman banquet? Because like I feel like Tacitus, your xenophobia is like showing here, number one. Number two, like it's very true. Like a lot of times when they did make alliances, they were drinking a lot. And the reason for that was like there was a truthishness in there. And there was also this idea of sharing a communal drink together, like they weren't being poisoned. And this is where they swore oaths. And it was a time to all be together.
It's like a sign of trust if you can drink together and eat together and be convivial and things like that. Like, I think that it's not just that, like, oh, we must get completely trashed so that we all know that we're being honest. Like, but I don't think it's not about that either.
Look, 2 things can be true at once, right? I also think that, like, when people get together in these groups to celebrate, to worship, to feast, to make these alliances, there's a certain amount of revelry and drinking that happens to show that no one is going to poison the other. Like, we can all let our guard down around each other. We don't have to have our swords at the ready and our wits about us. Like, we are friends.
So the Germanic people, Tacitus believed, were a people who spoke their minds. They did not keep secrets. They did not engage in wily tactics to defeat their enemies. No, Tacitus romanticizes this in order to, again, denigrate the Romans.
You want to ask what happened in the Teutoburg Forest? Because I think they would beg to differ.
Well, yeah, and I think this is after the Teutoburg Forest.
I know. It very much is. Everyone knew about that. Like, that was during, like, early in Augustus's reign.
But that's that's what made it such a kick in the teeth to the Romans, right? They were outmaneuvered and outthought and outwilied by, a simple Germanic tribe. But then again, Arminius was Romanized.
And he was like, oh yeah, I can pretend to be just one of you, and then I'm going to go back and strike a blow for my people.
So Tacitus has this wily Roman moment here when he says, quote, "If you will but humor their excess in drinking and supply them with as much as they covet, it will be no less easy to vanquish them by vices than by arms." He's like, get them drunk and then slaughter them all. That's the Roman way.
Get them drunk, slaughter them all, take one of their high-ranking sons as captive, and wait and see what happens in 25 years.
Right, again, the Roman way. Getting your ass kicked in the Teutoburg Forest.
Tacitus tells us that the Germanic people weren't into corrupting shows and entertainments like the Romans. No, they would never put on a decadent play. However, the Germanic peoples did have this one public diversion. Quote, young men, such as make it their pastime, fling themselves naked, and dance amongst sharp swords and the deadly points of javelins. From habit they acquire their skill, and from their skill a graceful manner, yet from hence draw no gain or hire, though this adventurous gaiety has its reward, namely, that of pleasing the spectators.
It's just for the love of the game, okay?
The Germanic peoples were also dedicated gamblers. They played at dice and, quote, so desperately do they venture upon the chance of winning or losing, that when their whole substance is played away, they stake their liberty and their persons upon one and the last throw. The loser goes calmly into voluntary bondage. However younger he be, however stronger, he tamely suffers himself to be bound and sold by the winner. Such is their perseverance in an evil course. They themselves call it honor. And they even gambled sober, Jenny. I mean, the Romans have never done anything like this, right? Like, you never might have like a gambler in your family who is a man who somehow managed to wind up getting you sold into slavery to pay off his gambling debts. That never happened as the Romans, right?
Oh no, they don't sell themselves into slavery. They just sell their families into slavery. It's different. Totally different.
Yeah. If you're the man, you don't go. Yeah, totally. As opposed to like this one, which I'm like, if it was just you gambled your own liberty and went into enslavement because you were like a horrible gambler, like I have a little more respect for that honor rather than like, well, see, here's the thing.
Take my wife, please.
Take my wife and children, please, and don't take me. Like, one sounds worse than the other. They're both bad.
I mean, I think that might be Tacitus's point.
Yeah.
Are we agreeing with Tacitus here?
The thing is, I kind of am coming down on the side of like the Germanic peoples are better here for at least like, even if they do it sober, it's only just the guy who made the bet going, not his whole family.
Okay. So moving on, let's talk about Germanic kingship, because this turns out to be kind of important as we talk about the Goths. So the Germanic people, according to Tacitus, had a society of chieftains who owed their allegiance to a king. He did not rule by dictatorship. The whole community, or at least the aristocracy, debated various matters and even voted for their kings. They did this on specific days of assembly based on the phases of the moon, since they did not count time in days but in nights. These assemblies could take days to form, and when they did, they, quote, sit down as they list, promiscuously, like a crowd, and all armed. And drunk, obviously. Generals won their position through bravery on the battlefield. Kings did not have absolute power. Their control was not, quote, unbounded or arbitrary, and their generals gained obedience not by force, but by setting a good example of courage and battlefield prowess. Only priests were allowed to punish people, including whipping them for disobedience. And I see echoes of Alaric's kingship in this, because his was a kingship of consensus and an elected position. Some sources described him as being lifted on a shield when he was chosen as king. So here's another detail that actually matches with the little we know about Gothic culture.
They've got to be charismatic. That's how they hold things together. So how much power did kings have in Gothic culture? Well, Peter Heather, in his book The Goths, tells us that Ammianus Marcellinus, an important eyewitness source for the early migration era, quote, depicts Gothic leaders as frequently unable to control the martial enthusiasm of their own followers. However, if we track the Gothones with the Goths, Tacitus tells us that their kings had more power in their culture than any other Germanic cultures. Perhaps they weren't elected or didn't have to make decisions by drunken community debate. So we kind of have a contradictory picture here, right? Tacitus continues to tell us, quote, it is by the priests that silence is enjoined, and with the power of correction the priests are then invested. Then the king or chief is heard, as are others, each according to his precedence in age or in nobility, or in warlike renown, or in eloquence, and the influence of every speaker proceeds rather from his ability to persuade than from any authority to command. If the proposition displease, they reject it by an inarticulate murmur. If it be pleasing, they brandish their javelins. The most honorable manner of signifying their assent is to express their applause by the sound of their arms.
Kings and other administrative leaders were appointed at these community gatherings. These kings did not rule unilaterally, as we've said, but once established, they could attract followers. Tacitus tells us that, quote, this is their principal state, this their chief force, to be at all times surrounded with a huge band of chosen young men for ornament and glory in peace, for security and defense in war. Nor is it among his own people only, but even from the neighboring communities, that any of their princes reaps so much renown and a name so great when he surpasses in the number and magnanimity of his followers, for such are counted by embassies and distinguished with presents, and by the terror of their fame alone often dissipate wars. So I really want to include that because I think this comes back later in later episodes. You know, the reputation of a king and his ability to attract followers and the importance of those followers in terms of what the courtly system looked like in later Gothic kingdoms, which we will get to.
Zootopia 2 has come home to Disney+.
Let's go!
Get ready for a new case.
We're the greatest partners of all time!
New friends.
Gary the Snake.
And your last name?
The Snake.
Dream Team. Hit new habitats.
Zootopia has a secret reptile population.
You can watch the record-breaking phenomenon at home. Zootopia 2, now available on Disney+, rated PG. And right now you can get Disney Plus and Hulu for just $4.99 a month for 3 months with a special limited time offer. Ends March 24th. After 3 months, plan auto-renews at $12.99 a month. Terms apply.
Hello everyone, Stakuyi here.
And I'm Gabby.
And we are the hosts of History of Everything, a podcast which you can probably guess by the name is, well, it's about everything. Do you want to know why people thought potatoes were evil and would give you syphilis? Are you curious about all the stories of the terrible and stupid ways that people have kicked the bucket over the years? Do you want to hear tales about all of the different badasses of history and the lives that they had brought to life? Well, if so, then look no further. History of Everything is just the right podcast for you. It's available on Spotify, Pandora, and anywhere else that you get your podcast from. Join us for some fun and just see how weird and wacky history can be.
Calling all kids in the car. Brittany and Meredith here from the chart-topping Family Road Trip Trivia Podcast. Are you dreading another silent car ride with the fam? We've got the cure. 3 rounds of fresh trivia every single week. Movies, music, even science and Disney. We've got something for every trivia buff in the car. No more crickets chirping on those long journeys. The Family Road Trip Trivia Podcast is your secret weapon for connecting and laughing with kids of all ages. Teens, toddlers, adults, it doesn't matter. Spark their curiosity and challenge their brains with every episode. New episodes drop weekly wherever you get your podcasts. Search for the Family Road Trip Trivia Podcast and turn those car rides into epic adventures.
So here's some fun details that I really just love. We're told that on the battlefield, it was a huge faux pas to surpass your king in feats of bravery or to fail to match his bravery. So you have to walk this line of exactly as much bravery as your king, but not more bravery. It was also to a warrior's lasting shame if he walked alive off a battlefield where his prince was slain. It was considered appropriate to fight to the death to save your prince or your chieftain and to credit him with all of your own brave deeds, but do not be braver than him, but also do not be less brave than him. It has to be the exact right amount of bravery, you guys.
Yeah, so what we're seeing here is all of these men have to be as good as their king. If their king is an excellent king, they all have to be good. And if their king isn't a good king, they have to somehow be good enough to survive and keep their king alive, but not too good.
They can't be too good, but if they want to increase their king's glory and sort of cover for him, I guess they have to be better, but not in a way that makes him look bad.
Exactly. Not in a way that shows them as being better. It's a mindfuck.
Here's another key fact. It was important for young men to prove themselves in war, such that if a community was too peaceful, its young men might leave to find a more warlike one where they could prove themselves and their valor. So there was this incentive for endless war. And this reminds me of Celtic culture with their cattle raids. I mean, and the Celts were also a culture that their wealth was in cattle, so that makes a lot of sense.
Tacitus tells us that attendees at Gothic assemblies were allowed to accuse each other of crimes and even to prosecute capital offenses. Traitors and deserters were hung, cowards, sluggards, and, quote, unnatural prostitutes were buried alive and pressed into bogs under wooden hurdles. These were mainly people who were deemed to be, quote-unquote, effeminate and didn't conform to manly gender rules. Tacitus continues, quote, in punishing of glaring inequities, it behooves likewise to display them to sight, but effeminacy and pollution must be buried and concealed, end quote.
There's some homophobia, shocker.
And Tacitus further tells us that in the case of most lesser crimes, those convicted had to pay restitution in cattle or in horses.
There's more in Tacitus, but I think this is a good overview. This covers a lot. Are there any parallels here that we can connect to the Goths as we know them, or the Weilbark or Chernikov cultures? What do we think is specifically Gothic in Tacitus versus Germanic in general? Well, there are some similarities and some contradictions. So the archaeology paints a picture of a people heavily invested in cattle and horses, which is true in Tacitus as well, but we're also getting the sense of a much more martial culture in Tacitus than the evidence in the ground, if you take it as them not burying their weapons in the ground as a sign that they weren't martial, which is questionable.
Tacitus also paints the Germanic peoples as indigenous to the land, and not from anywhere else, not migrants. And that's at odds with the archaeological picture of a people who did move, probably from northern Poland to the shores of the Black Sea. Many historians believe that they were not homogeneous. Some have suggested that they may have been multi-ethnic coalitions, especially as the Chernikov culture arrived in its new region and integrated with other groups. So, how much can we connect Tacitus's picture of the Germanic peoples with what we know about the Goths, especially during this time? There are parallels, as we've seen, but it's very difficult, if not impossible, to say anything definitively. Historians don't even agree that the Weilbark and Chernikov cultures can be said to be Goths, or that Goths could be said to be Germanic. And there are a lot of reasons not to take everything Tacitus says as pure fact, ranging from his own biases and agenda, to the fact that he probably never met the people he was writing about, to the people who were translating and preserving his own work. But we do have some other information about the Goths, specifically from other sources. And let's take a brief 6-page look at what else we know from some of these other sources. 6-page, single-spaced.
We're not done.
Jenny doesn't believe in double spacing.
So let's take a look at women in Gothic society as seeresses and warriors. So we've covered the Germanic seeress Veleda in an episode for our Patreon about the Batavi, which I've discussed before. The Batavi were a Germanic people who lived in what's now the Netherlands around the Rhine, and they were deadly mercenaries whose specialty was amphibious warfare. They may have begun their relationship with Rome on the blasted battlefields of Gaul, fighting for Julius Caesar against Vercingetorix. For centuries after, the Batavi served as the Julio-Claudian emperor's closest bodyguard, closer even than Praetorians. And if you want the full series, the episode on that, check out our Patreon, it's on there. But eventually the Romans and the Batavi had a nasty breakup. It came in the form of the Batavi Rebellion, which was around 69 to 70 AD. And in that rebellion, a sorceress named Veleda played an important role. She was a virgin seeress who lived in a tower. No one was allowed to see her in person. Her relatives carried messages between her and her supplicants. She helped incite the Batavi rebellion, prophesied its success, and received gifts for her wisdom, including an entire Roman trireme. Hell yes.
We also have some information about Germanic seeresses in our Berserkers episode. And that episode covered the Berserker tradition, which was found in both Viking culture and in ancient Germanic culture. Images of men wearing bearskins and wolfskins appeared as early as on Trajan's column, showing Trajan's conquest of Dacia in 101 to 106 AD. Dacia would have been roughly contiguous with that territory of Oium on the Black Sea. So those people may have been not just Germans, but Goths, and not just Goths, but Thracians, because the Dacians are also sometimes considered Thracians. But anyway.
Your whole theory that the Goths were actually Thracians, I don't think that's far-fetched either.
No, I don't think that they were Thracians. I think that there was intermixing of Thracians in this culture.
Right. I think that there was a significant overlap. Like, I don't think there was a huge dividing line between Goths and Thracians.
Yeah, there wasn't a consistent culture, and some of the sources I wanted weren't in English. So anyway.
Welcome to my world. That's why I've been very testy these past 2 months, in addition to other reasons. Anyway, moving on.
She has been. It's been a very trying time for me. Thoughts and prayers.
So you asked me to do this. I didn't want to for this reason.
I mean, I just asked you to tell us about their culture. I didn't know it was going to be this much of a mess. But anyway.
I knew.
So were berserkers a part of Gothic culture from before the time there were Goths? Yes, they were. But Jenny says it's hard to say, but maybe. But I'm just saying yes.
I think that it's probably the case, especially considering that you have those berserker images from Dacia smack dab in the middle of Gothic territory. I mean, maybe a little bit earlier, but maybe just when the people of the Wildbark culture were just getting to Oium, right? Question mark. I guess we're just deciding that that's what happened now.
I think you also have to remember that, like, Dacia and those areas were fighting constantly with, like, Rome and other cultures coming in and pressing on them for their land and space. So, like, there's going to be so much exchange going on, and people who are Dacians at one point in time may be in that same place. They might be displaced several times. Like, there's a lot going on there.
Yeah, it's hard to say who those people in the bearskins and the wolfskins actually were. But I think that they were Goths, okay? I think that that's like Alaric's granddad. Maybe great-great-great-great-great-granddad, okay?
I think they were Goths and possibly some Thracians in there. One thing we wanted to bring up here is the possibility of priestesses leading berserker rites. And I'm here for this because we see priestesses having this role, particularly in this culture, of leading these rites. And sometimes those rites are violent.
So we don't know much or anything about how these rites were conducted. These rites of transforming men into bear men and berserkers, right? Listen to our Berserkers episode. We go into a lot more detail on that. But we do have evidence that women played a role as priestesses in Germanic communities. We have mention of figures like Veleda in the ancient sources, and a more recent burial from 980 AD in Denmark near a ring fortress held a person believed to be a Volga or Viking seeress. So this is a lot more recent than the time period we're talking about, and also it's in a different place. And, potentially there's a real question about whether you could say the Vikings had cultural continuity with the Goths. But this woman's grave could point to continuity with figures like Veleda in Germanic history. And here's what I said about it in the Berserker episode. I'm just quoting myself. Quote, "She was clearly high status, buried in blue and red garments stitched with golden thread. She was buried on a horse-drawn carriage, as the greatest kings and heroes were. She wore silver toe rings and had 2 bronze bowls that may have come from Central Asia, as well as potentially ritualistic objects such as owl pellets and bones from birds and small mammals. She was also buried with a strange metal wand with bronze fittings, perhaps a staff or magic wand. But one of the most interesting finds in her grave was a collection of henbane seeds kept in a small purse. So henbane seeds can cause hallucinations, among other things, and they were only discovered in women's graves. So were these seeress tools? Question mark?
Were they used to poison their husbands when they got out of line? I don't know.
I see this as a yes and, Jen. It's all about the dosage.
So there's also some discussion of women as warriors. Remember that the Goths were interchangeably called Scythians by the Romans, and Scythian warrior women were famously the inspiration for the Greek stories about Amazons. And we trace that history in our Amazons episodes. This calling them Scythians interchangeably by the Romans may have been a clue that there were martial women among the Goths. And again, Tacitus describes marital gifts of weapons and shields to remind women that they are, quote, equally yoked to their men in war and adventure and life. These were not women who stayed home, and I know if I was going to be on a battlefield, I would at the very least know how to defend myself. Jordanes corroborates this by telling us a fascinating story about how the Goths were descended from Amazons.
So I love this because it's in Jordanes. And Jordanes, remember, is our Gothic source. Granted, he's a late Gothic source who was Romanized and Christianized. So he has his own flaws, but I love this story. And I think I told parts of it in our Amazons episodes, but I'm going to tell it again. So sometime after the Goths settled in Oyam, according to Jordanes, their king died, leaving the community temporarily unprotected. During that time, a neighboring tribe tried to take advantage by kidnapping all the Gothic women. But the women put up a fierce fight, quote from Jordanes, as they had been taught to do by their husbands, and kicked those guys' asses. This victory supercharged the women's confidence. Egging each other on, the women took up weapons and elected two of the boldest among them, Lampeto and Marpesia, to lead them. Then they took up the defense of their land themselves and started conquering their neighbors. Eventually, Lampeto agreed to stay behind and guard the Goths' homeland, while Marpesia put together a band of her besties and rode off into Asia to expand their territory. As one does.
Marpesia and her Amazons rampaged through the countryside until they came to the Caucasus Mountains, which halted their progress. Jordanes mentions a quote about this in Virgil. Quote, like to a hard flint or the Marpesian cliff. And Marpesia stayed for a while, strengthened her numbers, and then crossed the river to subdue all the lands of Asia. And it's here that Jordanes starts to refer to these women as Amazons. And Marpesia and her Gothic Amazons conquered a long list of tribes, founded cities, and built the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. And the quote goes, quote, at Ephesus also they built a very costly and beautiful temple for Diana, Artemis, because of her delight in archery and the chase, arts to which they were themselves devoted. And they founded a kingdom in Asia that lasted for a century. This is all mythical, but like I said, we have seen this when we talked about the Temple of Artemis. My favorite was this idea that the Amazons came by once a year to scent mark the place and just rub up against it and remind you this is their temple, their city. Ephesus was their city.
When you were researching Ephesus, did it come up that these were Gothic Amazons, Jen?
Well, it's a bit complicated, right? We don't actually know that they were Gothic Amazons. They might have been Gothic Amazons.
Jordanes says they were Gothic Amazons. Were you looking at Jordanes, or did this come from another source when you were looking at it? I'm so curious.
I used the Bettany Hughes book. I also went into Theoi. All my sources are there. So I don't know. First off, Jordanes is such a late source. And the founding of that temple of Artemis at Ephesus way predates all of this. So I don't have an answer for you because also the Temple of Artemis was sometimes said to be founded by Amazons who were running away from Dionysus when he was trying to subjugate them. But that myth itself, I believe, is later. So I don't have an answer for you. It's in several different places. But what I found interesting is the sort of dovetailing here of if these Gothic Amazons founded it and the Goths are the ones who ultimately were one of the death knells in the Temple of Artemis, it has a real circular narrative.
Because we know that the Goths at some point at the end of the Ephesus history sacked the temple as well. So yeah, you're right. It is a circular narrative. And I'm just I wonder what the significance of that is.
And I don't have an answer of obviously it's mythical, but there's a literary convention we're also seeing here in this story in how Jordanes is telling us and what we know of the history. It's really tough to know. I mean, I would suspect more logically it might have been Scythians, but it could have also, the Temple of Artemis became this huge refuge for people in the ancient world. So it's just as easily could have been people fleeing Greece, could have been people fleeing Dionysus. It could have been anything.
I find this just super interesting. And it might be that Jordanes is just sort of tying his Amazons to something really historical, the significance of which resonates down to his time.
Yeah, there could be some mythology making that's going on here. But again, I don't think he's wrong, in that mythology where the Temple of Artemis was built by sort of Amazons. I've seen it that Dionysus was the villain. I've seen it that it could have been Scythian women or Proto-Gothic women who founded this temple. I've seen all of these things in that narrative. I think since they're both mythical, I tended to go with the older source, but the reality was this area, as I talked about in that episode, there was a long-standing tradition of worshiping a mother goddess there long before any of this, almost prehistoric. But I do like the conceit Jordanes is giving us here. I don't agree with it, but I like it.
I like it too. So anyway, finally, according to Jordanes, there's more to this story. Finally, according to Jordanes, these powerful Gothic Amazon women decided to marry into neighboring tribes so that they could, preserve their peoples or whatever. But there was a problem. These ladies did not want to have actual relationships with men. They did not. They didn't even want kids. They preferred fictional and mythological men. Gosh, relatable. And they were child-free. Jordanes says, quote, among them childbearing was detested, though everywhere else it is desired. I mean, I find that quite relatable, personally. That's just how I feel. Jordanes says these women decided to have kids anyway for the future of their people and whatnot, but they were willing to meet with their husbands only once a year, during which they would give over any male children to the men for rearing. They kept the girls and raised them to be warriors. Although some say they exposed the boys to the elements, quote, with the haste like that of a stepmother.
Women always the villain, whether you're their mom or stepmother.
You're not wrong there.
There's a lot going on with what and who they thought the Amazons were and how their society functioned.
I know I saw a passage like this, if not this passage, in the Amazons episodes long before I really understood who Jordanes was.
Absolutely, and I've seen it in the mythology too, and I guess I'm the one who's done probably the most studying of Artemis. And I think the fact that the temple of Artemis was there and the fact that Artemis was the goddess of protecting young children, particularly young girls and young boys before a certain age, it's possible that these boys were also given over to the temple until such time as they were a certain age. So let's get back to these Amazons. So these Amazons, Jordanes tells us, were the ancestors of other famous Amazons like Hippolyta and Penthesilea. Quote, these women are said to have kept their power even to the time of Alexander the Great, which is true. We've talked about how Alexander the Great's sister was most likely a Scythian warrior woman. So how much of this can be based on true events? We don't really know, and that's why I've been waffling so much about Artemis and her worship in Ephesus. But there's one thing that stood out to us that seemed very real. This idea of women being taught to fight by their husbands, because we could both imagine this happening. Husbands who brought their wives into battle, who migrated with them into dangerous areas where they had to drive out existing tribes and peoples, who brought them to war to tend their wounds and inspire their fighting. These husbands, no doubt, wanted their wives to know how to handle a weapon. They wanted them to be able to protect themselves because they knew how dangerous their surroundings were.
Right, I would assume so, because there would be a thought listen, I might not always be there to defend you. If their wives are truly equally yoked in adventure and war, they'd be like, right, babe, you need to know how to handle this sword. I feel like that must have been a conversation that happened a lot.
You also need to be able to protect yourself from animals?
So, Jen, sit down. Listen, Julius Caesar has something to say.
Oh, motherfucker. Of course he does. Of course. It's not been a bad 5 weeks. We've got to bring back the original populace. Come on.
I didn't call Julius Caesar for this episode because I really felt that the Germanic people that he was talking about were probably not the Goths. And I felt like he would go on and on and on about the Germanic people. And I'd be like, babe, I don't need to know all this. I just need little bits that are relevant to Jordanes. And he'd be like, who the fuck is Jordanes? And then we'd have to have a whole conversation about that. I did not have time. I just cherry picked what he's already written down. Okay. Don't tell him. I don't want to talk about it. So Julius Caesar met some Germanic people when he went up to do terrible things in Gaul around 58 to 54 BC. We have talked about that in our Julius Caesar episodes if you want the deep dive. He was not in the same place as the precursors to the Goths, and not the same time. I really think that the furthest north he went was around the Netherlands. So the people he was writing about probably weren't Goths. But he did say some stuff in the commentaries that stuck with me, and I went back to find it. And according to Julius Caesar, the Germanic people drew 1,000 armed men, not 100, annually from each district to wage war outside their borders. So some of the stuff he says is corroborated in Tacitus, or, similar. And again, he paints this picture of this revolving door recruitment system where the men who stayed home played a support role and farmed and then had to go to war the following year. He said the Germans all owned land in common and mainly ate milk and meat, even though he mentions they're also farmers. And sometimes when you see echoes like this, it doesn't necessarily mean that this is true, more true. It means that maybe Tacitus was lifting some things from Caesar.
So, like Tacitus, Julius Caesar describes the Germanic peoples as very large, strapping people who were undisciplined and criminally lazy, although they did keep kicking his ass. But anyway, quote, due to the nature of their food, their regular exercise, and their freedom of life, for from childhood they are not taught a sense of duty or discipline, and they do nothing unless they want to, facilitates their strength and makes men of immense bodily stature. Moreover, they have regularly trained themselves to wear nothing, even in the coldest places, except skins, the scantiness of which leaves a great part of the body bare, and they bathe in the rivers.
They're so scantily clad at all times. Goodness.
I mean,
these strapping barbarian bodies. Is Julius Caesar bisexual? Do we even need to question that? I mean,
yes, he's a bisexual short king. Like, we know this. It is known.
I know, we've met.
So what I was going to say was, Jenny and I talked about the scantily cladness, and I was saying to her, like, when I came over to North Carolina from London, like, I didn't wear a coat or anything more than a sweater my first almost 2 years.
Only the cocksock in battle, only the cocksock.
Pretty much, and flip-flops. That's all I wore. Most of last month, like, I was wearing flip-flops until when it got really cold and I had to put on sneakers. This is the first time I had to buy a coat. So, like, I can totally understand Julius Caesar coming from a more temperate climate, being like, what are these people wearing? They're not dressed appropriately. And these people being like, I don't know, this is summer for us. I wanted to talk for a minute about them bathing in the rivers. Like, what Julius Caesar is saying here is he's not seeing that they have, like, their gross communal Roman bathhouses that, like, you know, we know if you went to a public bathhouse was tantamount to just getting a communicable water-based disease.
You're basically going to get gangrene if you go into those baths.
From the sources, we know this. What he's saying is they didn't have public pools. They had to just jump in the rivers to bathe. I'm like, oh, it's probably a little bit cleaner. Like, at least it's running water. So there's some stuff here from our guy, Julius Caesar, that's really similar to what Tacitus said. And while we wouldn't take this as corroborated facts so much as either one, maybe Tacitus had read the commentaries, don't tell Julius Caesar, he will fawn over that, and pulled from there, then he'll sue them for copyright infringement. Or two,
one or the other, or maybe both.
It will be both. Or two, these stereotypes were floating around in both times. And Caesar was writing in the 50s BC, so like 150 years before Tacitus. I imagine, knowing that Tacitus did not go into these areas, that he definitely studied his commentaries.
Yeah, I just think Tacitus's information is not updated from 150 years ago. That's very questionable. So I want to talk about kingship a little bit more now because we have some information from Jordanes that's going to turn out to be really important. We get a contradictory picture of kingship from the ancient sources. Tacitus and Caesar indicate that the Germanic peoples tended to elect their kings, who ruled mainly by consensus. But Tacitus also states that the Gothones, who may or may not have been the Goths specifically, had stricter kings and ruling structures than other Germanic peoples. And you get a hint of this from Jordanes. His account is full of great deeds by great men. This is going to recur a lot in this vast series of Goth stuff that I'm building here. There's so many great deeds by great men. And this includes all the kings, both mythical and historical, who shaped Gothic history. He builds a picture of a people who followed and obeyed their kings, not one who elected and argued with the kings. Great deeds by great men is a feature of Germanic myth-making, which we'll get into in more depth in a longer episode. Remember how sources like Pliny, Tacitus, and Strabo describe a people called the Gothones as subject to the Lygians, or maybe Lugians, a Celtic people, and the Germanic Vandals? Herwig Wolfram, who was my contemporary expert on Gothic history and culture, whose work I'm drawing from in a lot of this, he claims that the Goths' possible history of subjugation by the Lygians or Lugians and the Vandals, quote, speaks inevitably of armed conflict. This subjugation has been mostly erased by Jordanes in his early history of the Goths, but Jordanes does speak of an alternate history that may represent a kind of cultural memory.
And Jordanes says, quote, nor do we find anywhere in the Goths written records, legends which tell of their subjugation to slavery in Britain or in some other island, or of their redemption by a certain man at the cost of a single horse. Of course, if anyone in our city says that the Goths have an origin different from that I have related, let him object. For myself, I prefer to believe what I have read, rather than put trust in old wives' tales. So it seems that, according to Jordanes, there was an alternate oral history about the Goths that said they were subjugated in Britain, a Celtic culture at the time, possibly like the Lygians, or some other island, and were released from their bondage at the price of a single horse. This would have been kind of an insulting myth, suggesting the people weren't worth very much. So, I think, maybe it was what are they called?
The Akalteke horses?
Akalteke. So maybe it was one Akalteke horse. They're worth so much money even now. I'm like, yeah, probably you could buy my whole family for that horse.
Wars were fought over those horses. Oh my, worth a kingdom. And if you look at pictures of them, you will see why. There's never been a horse more beautiful, although all horses are beautiful.
Maybe it was an Akalteke and they thought it was a unicorn horse and they were like, well, yeah, okay, fine.
So Jourdain scornfully dismisses this myth about the Goths being enslaved somewhere and released on the price of a single horse, but it might point to a history of the Goths as subject to another more powerful tribe, maybe a Celtic one at some point. And again, all of this is so ephemeral that it's super questionable, we're connecting so many dots here. It's on this ephemeral evidence and the equally ephemeral mention of Gothones in sources like Pliny and Tacitus and Strabo that Herwig Wolfram builds an argument that the Goths might have been a people who struggled, who fought for their independence, and who early in their history developed a stronger leadership structure than surrounding Germanic tribes, even before their written history started. He says, quote, "The strength of the Goths lay in a kingship whose authority noticeably surpassed that usually found among Germanic peoples. As the central authority of the wandering tribe, the king could employ the resources of his smaller tribe more effectively than the leading stratum of larger kingless tribal groups could use theirs. The Goths developed a great attraction for non-Goths because the Gothic kings decided questions of tribal membership quickly and on occasion against tradition. Finally, the Gothic kingship had the ability to not only form the Exercitus Gothorum, which is the Gothic military, as a polyethnic group, but also to structure it on the basis of retainership. These people obeyed kings who combined the sacred prestige of the Reudans, or the elected kingship, with the power of the Reichs, which was the kingship concept among the Goths. So Jen, what do you think about that paragraph?
I think these kings had a lot of riz, right? They had so much charisma to keep these people together. We're going to see that echoing down to Jenny's boy Alaric.
If you could sum up that entire paragraph in one sentence, Gothic kings had riz. More riz than other Germanic peoples.
I feel like the fact that we've said riz means now that word is dead, and that's great. I'm happy to make that word die.
Put a stake in it. It's done. I'm always the last adopter of every trend.
It's true. So, what can all of this tell us about kingship in Gothic times? Well, we've got 10 more episodes to go, and we'll talk more about this in detail as we delve into the history of the Goths as they collided with those pesky Romans and how their kingship functioned. Because that story is coming up next, and you can't really talk about the Goths without talking about their relationship with the Romans. And that story begins in the Migration era. And that's where we're going to start our story on Gothic history in our next episode.
Get excited. We're finally going to talk about the Migration era.
So we'll be back in 2 weeks. In the meantime, catch up with us on social at Ancient History Fangirl on Instagram. That's where we're most active at the moment. We're also on Threads and Blue Sky. On all of those, we're at Ancient History Fangirl. And you can join our Patreon. Our Patreon is the way we're able to support this podcast, to do this research, and bring you these stories. We don't make enough from advertising. Without the Patreon, we simply wouldn't be able to keep the podcast running. I would also like to say we have a newsletter. It's monthly. You can sign up for it at ancienthistoryfangirl.com. That's a great way to find out the projects we're working on next, upcoming episodes, and also writing projects. We will be sending that out regularly. I know that at the moment, social media is a tricky landscape, and none of us know quite where we want to land based on what the tech bros are doing. So that's a good place where you can hear our voices and not be beholden to people licking the toes of certain other leaders. Oh, wait, we might have to cut that out.
Certain orange fascists. Yes, correct.
So, Jenny, do we have any patrons to thank this month?
We do. We have one. So if you go to patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl, you can sign up to our Patreon, and we will thank you, just like we're thanking this person, Danny the Spoon Lord. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you, Danny.
And thank you all so much for listening. We will see you
whenever we see you next.
Hey, Hey everyone, it's Jenny and Jen here, and as a special extra treat, we are giving you a section of the audiobook version of my novel, Enemy of My Dreams.
This is actually the opening chapter or prologue of Jenny's book, and it happened in the aftermath of the Battle of Frigidus in 394 AD, when the Romans put their Gothic auxiliaries in the front of the battle to take most of the casualties. Alaric was leading that band, and he lost about 10,000 men. In Jenny's version of the story, that's the inciting event that radicalizes him towards revolution.
We hope you enjoy this extra snippet, and the book is now out in stores. It is so exciting, and the audiobook is also out, and it is narrated by the brilliant Lisa Flanagan, who does such a good job. I really love her narration. It is so good, and she really brings it to life. Pick it up wherever you get books or audiobooks.
3 days after the last battle ended, the mighty Bora still stalked the floodplain. It shrieked and murmured amongst the broken war machines and sent dust spirals walking amidst the dead. The men were saying it was the wind that won them this war, that the gods had sent it to drive the enemy's arrows back in their faces. Alaric of the Goths set his back to the battlefield, the Bora snapping his cloak around his heels. Someone should tell the gods then that the thrice-damned battle is over. Before him, the usurper Eugenius knelt on the ground. Even kneeling, he was thin and stooped as an overtall reed. The wind filled the executioner's stained cloak like a tattered sail and snatched the words from the condemned man's mouth. 10,000 of his own dead to achieve this. Half the Foederati, and the Romans had barely scratched their breastplates. A heavy hand clapped down on Alaric's shoulder. Well done. The General Stilicho smiled, jovial as Saturnalia. Without you, we never would have taken that valley. You have covered yourself in glory these past days. Glory. Alaric felt a muscle in his jaw clench. There had been nothing glorious about what happened in that valley. He'd walked out covered only in blood. His men's as much as his enemies. The Emperor Theodosius stepped out of the crowd below, swollen with his own importance. He interrupted Eugenius's last words with a speech about the Christian God who'd brought them victory. Mercifully, the wind obscured most of it. The Emperor will want to see you, Stilicho said. He will want account of your dead, and if you play it right, there will be a reward. You mean the homeland he promised? Alaric could not keep the bitterness from his voice. For years, Theodosius had been promising land, always after the next great victory and the next. His people were still landless and homeless, and now half of them were dead. If that was a coincidence, he'd eat his own boots. Must you do this every time? Stilicho let out an aggrieved sigh. The Emperor owes this victory to you, but you must be politic, Alaric. You stand to gain much, given time. Alaric shook his head grimly. If there was one thing his people did not have, it was time. He remembered the Huns sweeping down from the eastern hills, lines of homesteads burning. It was an old memory, one from his childhood, but it was still happening. Stilicho glanced at his battered, blood-stained cuirass and frowned. Be sure to clean yourself up first. Cut your hair, for God's sake. Try not to look so much like a barbarian. Down below, Theodosius had finished his talk of God. He gave an impassive nod to the executioner. The Bora stopped just as the axe fell. The imperial tent was full of rich fabrics and rare wood, all the comforts the emperor could not do without on campaign. Theodosius sat with his head bent over a solid oak desk, making scratch marks on a wax tablet, his scalp pink with sunburn. Alaric thought of the bent backs, the sweat and suffering that had brought the emperor's desk this far. At length, Theodosius spoke. Your report? By my reckon, we lost 10,000. The emperor's hand stilled. Tell me how you managed to lose half of the Federati. The scouts told us that the rim was clear. It wasn't. The archers picked us off like turtles in a bucket. And you lost 10,000 of my Gothic troops. Theodosius set his stylus down and regarded him coldly. Eyes narrowed like a merchant who suspected weevils in the grain. Stilicho says that without your valor we would all be meat for the crows. But I know that God won us this war. He was the one who sent the wind. Emperor, with respect, Alaric said flatly, your God did not suffer and die to win you that valley. And it serves you to credit him, since he asks neither payment nor land in return. You have a lot of nerve, Theodosius frowned. Perhaps you do not realize you are speaking to your greatest ally, Alaric. I've defended you before the Senate, and you've done nothing to make my work easier. Your people are ungovernable. They pillage when they should be farming. I visit your camps to find women and children wandering about in a war zone. If I granted your people land now, how would I know they would farm it rather than simply using it as a base for plunder? They would not have to follow my army if they had land of their own. If the women and children had somewhere safe to go, I've offered to settle them in camps. Over his steaming corpse. People die like rats in those camps. How do you think it will look to the Senate if I settle 10,000 armed Goths in the Danube Valley so soon after Eugenius turned? If your people turned to pillaging honest Romans, I'd expect to be stoned in the streets. Theodosius paused to pour himself wine, offering none. Eugenius was part Frankish, you know. My people are Tervingi. That isn't even the same tribe. You know that, and I know that. But to the Senate and the people, you are all the same. Theodosius picked up his stylus and resumed his scratchings. You are dismissed. You will keep your current position, but only because the Federati are loyal to you. Be grateful for my generosity. Alaric felt his teeth clench, as if it were not abundantly clear how the Romans saw his people. Barbarians, all of them. The Romans could give them the trappings, but in the end, it was his people in the valley fighting more of his people and the Romans reaping the reward. Stilicho would want him to bow and scrape, to make a conciliatory gesture toward the emperor's god. But he would fear no little man in a tent. Not after what he'd lived through. How long do you think I can keep the Federati loyal, Emperor? Alaric said quietly. If they are not paid in full. Theodosius's eyes snapped up. Is that a threat? When I make a threat, you will know it. For a moment, everything stilled. In the Emperor's face was the usual calm disdain. Something made Alaric glance at his upraised hand. It trembled. The Emperor feared him. Suddenly, Alaric understood. Theodosius had known he would walk into a slaughter. And Stilicho had given the order. To thin out his numbers against future rebellion. They both thought he'd be next to turn. Deliberately, Theodosius put down his stylus. You'll do well to remember whose camp you are in, he said evenly, and whose guards are just outside. And you will do well to remember exactly who the Federati are loyal to. Alaric bared his teeth in an expression that was nothing like a smile. Pay my men what you owe them, Emperor. Otherwise you had better pray to your god for another wind. Stilicho thought he would turn. It would be a shame to disappoint the great man.
Have you ever wondered how inbred the Habsburgs really were? What women in the past used for birth control? Or what Queen Victoria's 9 children got up to? On the History Tea Time podcast, I profile remarkable queens and LGBTQ+ royals, explore royal family trees, and delve into women's medical history and other fascinating topics. Join me every Tuesday for History Tea Time, wherever fine podcasts are enjoyed.